Italy. He has this claim on the kingdom of Naples. He invades, conquers Milan, conquers Florence, marches down to Naples, claims the throne there, but then has to come all the way back to France because the country's not really governable when he's not there. And all these military efforts in Italy seriously weakened the French monarchy. Cost a lot of money, distracted the king from things at home, and that was really a setback in the growth of the French monarchy. The turning point for France was the rule of Francis I, who ruled from 1515 to 1547, and he's the first truly new monarch that we find in France, and a major European figure, a major figure in European politics. He sets France on the path towards a stronger new monarchy. One of the things he does is he greatly increases both sale of office and sale of nobility. Now, sale of office especially is a deceptive thing. It brings you two things. It brings you instant money in your treasury because these offices are expensive and they're sold to middle-class people with money. And it brings you an instant bureaucrat because the guy's just bought the office. The trouble with it is when a person buys an office, that office becomes his personal property. It no longer belongs to the king or the state. And the person who buys that office can essentially do with it what he wants to. Now, the king hopes, of course, that he'll get the official, he'll get the money, and the official will do his job. Collect taxes, keep records, whatever the job might be. And the person might well do that. But the person also might not do that. And if he doesn't, what you've just done is you've chopped off a part of your own government and sold it, like a piece of cake. And that's not a very good direction to be going in. And a lot of officials didn't do the job they were supposed to do, or they would keep a lot of the revenue for themselves and only pass a bit along to the king. So it's a real double-edged sword, the sale of office. But the kings of France become dependent on it for revenue. And so, that's both a good and bad thing. Francis also makes an attempt to put more middle-class officials in government office and to kind of nudge out the nobles wherever he can, although he can't nudge them all out or even the majority of them. But he's on the way to creating, as much as he can, a new administrative class for the country, a loyal middle-class administrative group. Another big thing Francis I does is in 1516, he makes a deal with the Pope. Now, this goes back to the Pope's battle with the conciliar movement. You remember that after the Great Schism was healed, the Church Council really did take control of the church for a while, and the king had to make the Pope had to make deals with kings to get their backing against the church councils. This was a kind of late stage in these deals being made by the Pope with the king, and this deal gave Francis control over almost all important church appointments in France. So he could appoint the people he wanted to the church. And that meant that he could control the church's wealth and the church's power and use it for the purposes of the state, which is a big advantage when you're trying to build up the power of the state. So Francis I, by the time he dies in 1547, has reestablished the French monarchy on a pretty strong foundation. We'll move next to Spain and talk a little bit about Spain. Spain is an unusual case because for most of the Middle Ages, it was controlled by the Moors and was not a unified kingdom. And there was a long war of reconquest to make it into a Christian unified kingdom. In 1469, this process comes to a kind of climax when Spain is united into one kingdom by the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile. That's a very important turning point in the creation of the Spanish state. Now the king and queen of Spain have the problem of building up the power of the monarchy as it's being built up in other countries, especially right to the north in France, because Spain and France are rivals, and if France is increasing the power of the king, the Spanish have to do the same thing to keep up. Unfortunately, the kings of Spain, king and queen of Spain, cannot remove all the nobles out of government office and replace them with middle-class people because Spain doesn't have much of a middle class. But Spain does have a very large class of nobles, and many of the nobles towards the bottom of that class are pretty poor and pretty dependent on royal favor. So what happens in Spain is that more powerful nobles are edged out, and weaker, smaller nobles are brought in who will be more responsive to the king because they're more dependent on the king for their welfare, their fortunes, and for their whole livelihood. So that's a first step, and it's similar to what's happening in France. Also, the King of Spain, King and Queen of Spain, make a deal with the Pope, and they get control over church appointments in Spain. So they get the same power of the church behind them that we see behind the King of France. What happens in Spain, which is a little bit different from other countries, is that the King and Queen of Spain consolidate their power by enforcing a very strict religious uniformity. You have to be Catholic in Spain or else you're going to be in trouble. And this becomes a political tool because the king says, well, I'm protector, I am the protector of the church, and therefore if you do anything against the church, you do something against me. So heresy also becomes treason. And the king and queens set out to enforce religious uniformity. In 1483, they established the Spanish Inquisition, which is a court of court of traveling judges who will go around the country hearing cases of people accused of heresy or people accused of treason, which is really the same thing in Spain now. And people are locked up, people are executed for being heretics / disloyal to the monarchy. So they really use the king and queen use the power of religion to support their own political power. In 1492, the last Moors are driven out of Granada, so that part of Spain becomes Christian. Same year, all the Jews are expelled from Spain by the monarchy and their wealth is confiscated. In 1502, all the Arabs are expelled. So pretty soon you've got a very solid Catholic country, and that means a very solid country loyal to the king because these are almost the same thing in Spain. Okay, on to England. In England, the first new monarch is Henry VII, who comes to the throne in 1485 and goes to 1509. He comes in, again at a low point like we saw in France, the end of the War of the Roses, which was a war between two noble families for control of the French throne, the English throne. Both of these noble families, Lancaster and York, essentially lose out in the war, and Henry, who's a member of the Tudor family, establishes a brand new dynasty and sets on the road to restore royal power. One of the ways he does this is by doing what the English call living off his own, meaning he paid a large part of the government expenses from the revenues of his own private estates and private lands. So he's using his own personal money to pay for the operation of government, which didn't really happen in France and didn't really happen in Spain. The reason it happened in England is because the alternative, if you want tax money, you have to go to the Parliament, the House of Commons, get their consent to new taxation. This has been the tradition in England since the Middle Ages. It's a very strong tradition. No king can overcome it. And once you go crawling on your knees to Parliament for tax money, they'll ask you to make concessions, they'll take away parts of your power, you'll be weaker, you'll be dependent. And so not having to do that's a big plus. And Henry was happy not to do that. He was happy to use his own money to pay for the operation of the government. Henry also established something called the Court of Star Chamber, which becomes a major institution in English government all the way up into the 17th century. The Court of Star Chamber is essentially a royal court where Henry can take nobles largely who oppose him, put them on trial for treason, and get them convicted. Now, why did he have to establish a new court for that? Well, other courts in England operate by English common law. And that means everybody accused of a crime gets a trial by jury of their peers. So if you got a noble you're accusing of treason and you take him to a common law court, he's going to get a trial with a jury of nobles. And you can imagine what's going to happen there. They're not going to convict him. They're going to let him off because they don't want to see the king's power increased. And Henry knew this. He knew he's never going to make progress if he has to depend on common law courts. So he decides to set up a whole separate court system, the royal court system, of which the Court of Star Chamber was the first one. It doesn't replace common law. It's just a parallel court system. And the difference is the royal courts don't operate on English common law. They operate on the Justinian Code, the law of the Roman Empire, recently revived by the humanists and studied intensively. And Justinian Code or Roman law says that when somebody gets a trial, it's in a court with a judge appointed by the king. So Roman law gives tremendously more power to the king, the monarch, the emperor in the case of Rome, than would otherwise be the case. And that's exactly why Henry sets up this parallel court system and starts trying his opponents with Roman law. People don't like it. People in the common law courts don't like it. The parliament doesn't like it, but there's nothing they can do about it. Henry's exercising his power. He's followed by Henry VIII, who rules from 1509 to 1547, who continues to consolidate royal power with the help of several important prime ministers, the first of whom is Thomas Wolsey, and the latter of whom is Thomas Cromwell. You probably know that the main issue in Henry's rule was he needed a divorce from his wife, Catherine, because she was childless. He had no male heir. He was afraid his dynasty, the Tudor dynasty, would come to an end after 2 kings. So he wants to get a divorce. And he wants to marry his mistress and get a male heir, he hopes. You can't just get a divorce in the Catholic Church. So he sent a messenger down to the down to the Pope, to ask the Pope for special permission to get a divorce so he could remarry and, the whole process. Unfortunately, he found the Pope, we might say, indisposed. The Pope had just been involved in a war as an ally of the King of France in an alliance called the League of Cognac, in which they were fighting in Italy against the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who had expanded his power into southern Italy. It was threatening the Pope. The French didn't like this imperial influence in Italy, and so the Pope and France fight this war of the League of Cognac against Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, but Charles V wins. He captures Rome, and he puts the Pope in jail. When Henry VIII's officials come down and say, "Could you please give our king a divorce?" Charles V tells the Pope, he's asking for a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and she happens to be my niece. And we have a nice alliance with England right now because of this marriage, and I don't want to see it spoiled. So if you grant this divorce, you're going to rot in jail. And so the Pope says no divorce. At that point, Henry fires his Prime Minister Wolsey, hires a new Prime Minister Cromwell, decides to break with the Catholic Church and establish the Church of England, of which he himself is the head. We'll talk a lot more about this later in the course. There's a lot of parliamentary legislation that goes into making this break, but they essentially do break away from the Catholic Church and establish a new church, and then what happens essentially is Henry grants himself the divorce. But as a byproduct of this, he's got control of the church appointments, church monies, church lands. He takes church land, he sells it off to the highest bidder, puts the money in his treasury. So he's greatly increased royal power. The only place in Europe we don't see a new monarchy developing is in Germany, where Charles V is Holy Roman Emperor. And the problem there is Charles V doesn't just rule Germany. He has inherited the rule of a massive worldwide empire. He's King of Spain also because he's a grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella. He's Duke of Burgundy because his grandmother was Mary of Burgundy. He gets elected emperor because his father was the previous emperor. And so he controls this empire that includes Spain, Germany, the Low Countries, the Philippines, Spanish America, Spanish Pacific possessions, a vast empire that he can't possibly govern, and there's no way he can establish a new centralized monarchy to control these vastly separated lands with all different problems. And the lack of a new monarchy in Germany is going to be a major factor in the rise of the Reformation there.